It's an honor to meet you because I'm a big fan of the Latin America Daily Briefing. It's such a big help because, as you know, as you're gonna tell me, there's always something going on in every country in Latin America. People who think that who cover domestic affairs here in the United States, current events, they think that their head's been spinning for the past 4 years. I mean, try following Latin American politics for however long, and it's always something new, and I feel like they call it the daily briefing. I do feel like sometimes I feel like the president, and I feel like the Latin American daily briefing is like, hey, what's going on in Latin America today? What's going on in Peru? What's the situation like today in Venezuela or Cuba or wherever? I mean, thank you for coming on. I mean, how do you approach it? I mean, how do you put that thing together? Obviously, you have other people putting it together on different days. How does that work?
Well, just this past week has been, I've had a journalist who replaced me because I was taking a short break, but generally it's me most of the time. And it's funny that you mention how it's just all these different topics, because I feel like every year I say, well, this year has been the worst, without a doubt, since I started covering it. And I'm starting to think, no, this is just what it's like, because it can't be that every year is the worst. It's just, I think this is just the news from the region. But it has been fascinating to sort of watch the kaleidoscope, because there are certain definite trends that develop over each year or over each season. And it's sort of interesting to watch the ebb and flow of that as the years go by. I've been doing it for almost 6 years now. Although I didn't start the briefing, I came to it by accident through a job search.
Oh, really? It was just doing a job search and you landed on the Latin America Daily Briefing? How did that happen?
The report was created as an internal report for Open Society Foundation's Latin America program. But, and this was well before my time, they quickly realized that it was a valuable tool for other policymakers, or for actual policymakers. And they decided to make it public. And it has about 3,000 subscribers right now. And it's an interesting community. A lot of readers actually get back to me and tell me what they think about what I've put, or send me suggestions, which has been a really enjoyable chance to dialogue for me. While it stems from Open Society Foundations, the editorial decisions are all mine. So that's kind of exciting to always get to see what merits inclusion and what doesn't. A lot of this is curatorial. So, and how to frame it and what order to put it in, that's sort of a daily decision all the time. And I've gotten to meet a lot of different...
How do you make those decisions? I mean, because, like I said, in Latin America, there's usually multiple fires going on at one time, sometimes literal. And so how do you, usually what's at the top gets that headline, right? Brazil, we just saw that the vaccine, the Supreme Court is mandating the vaccine in Brazil, and Bolsonaro's hard-headed as ever, is not going to take it, and is still doing the hydroxychloroquine and all that stuff. So, the headline of the daily briefing is kind of setting the tone of that day's briefing, isn't it not?
It is, and sometimes it's hard for me to figure out what that should be, and I just start writing the briefing, sort of putting it together, and sometimes it's evident what it's going to be because it's either a major news piece or it's something that's been covered by all of the media outlets. And so necessarily I have to dedicate more space to it to cover what all the different media outlets have, because we haven't mentioned this yet in the interview, but it's basically a review of what comes out in the media. And I start out with the international media and then delve into the local media when issues merit and we need to understand. And I feel that readers would understand better.
I forgot to ask you, where are we speaking to you from?
I live in Buenos Aires. That's where the daily is usually coming out from, although I sometimes put it together traveling.
Yeah, I mean, that's got to be tough, right? Imagine, first you have to go through the day, so you go through it yourself? I mean, what's the schedule like? What's your daily schedule like when you're putting the briefing together? I mean, this is just a
It's
nuts and
fairly
bolts stuff, but I'm interested, because I read this thing. So I'm like, who is this woman? How does she do this? Right.
it actually tends to respond to what's going on in my personal life. So usually in the normal pre-pandemic world, I'd drop my kid off at school and sit down and comb through all the media outlets and just put it together. And now in the pandemic world with no school and very little childcare, a lot of times I'm putting it together at night and then finalizing it in the morning before I send it out.
And that's every day, huh? I mean,
yeah, I mean, again, if you're checking it every day, it's manageable. What I find tends to be more difficult is Mondays, because there's the accumulation of the weekend.
right.
Or when I take a week off for some reason, then I'm just like, but now how do we do it?
Yeah, I mean, I can't even take off a week from reading the daily briefing, because it's like it's like a novella in multiple novellas in different countries, and if you take a week off, you're like, okay, what's going on now? Like, when did I miss this? Then I have to go back to Wednesdays or Tuesdays briefing, which is great. The other thing I was going to say is that as I'm bilingual, but as a English dominant person, you do source a lot of Spanish language media, and which is good for me because I can read. When I first started trying to cover Latin American politics, you'd have to read like the local newspapers, and if you're not English dominant, it takes a while to first of all read it and then digest really what's going on. And so I really appreciate that it's an English language briefing, and it sources Spanish language media. But is there a Spanish language version of it?
There isn't, and I've gotten asked about that by a lot of the Latin America based readers. It is skewed towards Latin Americanists who are international and thus English speaking. And that's sort of a strange thing because I think a lot of the readers are bilingual at the very least, which is why I feel free to source things in Spanish. Also, because I think it's the only way to really get a stronger perspective on what's going on in a lot of these countries. Right,
if you're only giving us stuff from The Guardian or the New York Times, nobody would really trust the briefing.
Exactly. So I do think that's really important. And I also sort of work on the assumption that readers are Latin Americanists. I don't sit down and explain everything. It's not a Reuters piece.
Right.
It assumes a certain level of knowledge.
Right.
And I do feel free to sort of sprinkle in some Spanish in there, not terribly, not Spanglish or anything, but I do feel free to sort of assume that the reader is familiar with Spanish. Portuguese is my major flaw. I am not fluent at all, even though I'm working on it as much as I can.
I mean, I think we all are. When you hear somebody speak Portuguese, you're like, oh yeah, I need to learn that language. That sounds awesome. I have a friend who speaks Portuguese to me all the time. He rubs it in my face. But so yeah, what's your background? I mean, I saw that you're obviously your father was former foreign minister of Argentina, right? You went to London School of Economics. I mean, so what did you study in London?
I studied philosophy and public policy.
Philosophy. I mean, what's your bag as far as philosophy goes?
I like it. It adds to sort of the analysis of the current events. I didn't plan on being a journalist. I always worked in public policy, but I always sort of stumble on journalistic tasks, and this one's really set me on this path. I really enjoy this level of analysis on a daily basis. I
mean, and as you're how old were you when your dad was foreign minister? I mean, did that have effect? Like, oh wow, I can't imagine what it's like, but I would think like, oh wow, it makes politics real to me. It makes policy real.
I think no, I was a grown up, so I think I was fortunate in that sense that it didn't impact me in that way. Right. I had worked in public policy for years before he took on a post in the government, both from NGOs and from within the government as well. I mean, obviously on a far lesser level. And we always maintained a very strict Chinese wall, professionally speaking. So I never worked with him professionally, and that was very important to us. Actually, so I worked
even
in
just
government,
personally, right? I mean, I can imagine There's what's his name? I forget his name. He was the campaign manager for Bill Clinton in 1992, and his wife. He's a famous Democratic strategist, and his wife is a famous Republican strategist. And they're, people ask them like, how does that work? How does that marriage work? And their rule is no politics at the dinner table. So what is the current state of Latin America? I mean, as far as I can tell, following things like the briefing for the past 10 years plus, it's a roller coaster, right? You think Latin America or just certain countries are turning the corner, and then something happens and they're worse off than ever. I mean, so, it's 2020. The whole world just is surviving horrific pandemic, environmental catastrophe, yada, yada, yada. I mean, what is the state of Latin America?
Latin America, well, it's been said in a lot of places that COVID basically made what was bad about Latin America worse. And I think in a lot of ways, that's sort of the global takeaway. And it's not something I made up, but, it exacerbated inequalities. It made gender violence a worse situation. It's demonstrated these terrible inequalities in health and education access that we all knew about, but have really become sort of vivid and strongly marked right now. It hasn't affected climate justice, but it sort of adds on to everything else and makes it worse. So that's the year we're coming out of. And contrary to sort of decades past where there was the leftist swing or a neoliberal swing, which, like it or not, was at least sort of regional trends on how we should be responding to what's going on. Right now, there isn't that. There's lots of disparate trends, a lot of grasping at outsiders, but from both the left, the right, and just mavericks. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of an answer to the chronic dissatisfaction that is a regional trend for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I guess let's go country by country a little bit. I mean, this isn't a quiz or anything. I'm just want to pick your brain, Let's start with your home country of Argentina. I mean, is it safe to say that the big issue there is the push for abortion rights, for reproductive rights? I mean, that's getting the international headlines, right? But you tell me.
Well, I certainly hope that that's what's going to be the major headline of 2020. It's going to come to the Senate vote by the end of the year. It just passed the Senate commission. It passed the lower chamber last week. So this is all very
legalizing abortion to 14 weeks, right?
14 weeks after conception, elective, without, just for any reason. I think it's a major step forward. We did have this giant debate over it in 2018, and it didn't pass, which was very disappointing for women's rights activists. But I think it also sort of set the stage for now. It's been a far quieter debate this time around.
Yeah.
That was sort of massive. It took months and months. There were millions and millions of meetings with lots of people being heard in Congress. This time around, because of the pandemic and because of that previous debate, it's been far quicker.
Yeah.
And the president is pushing for it to come out.
Which is surprising, right?
Yes,
I mean, it's a pandemic, and here he is taking on this social issue that isn't dollars and cents. It's really, he seems to be, for whatever reason, right? When he introduced the bill, he was wearing a green tie, all that stuff. I mean, does he really believe it? Is he really for it?
He does. I think he really is for it. It was a major campaign promise. Abortion is heavily favored by his base, by the coalition base, but not to the point where it was sort of make or break, because it also it goes across party lines.
Right.
It was a major campaign promise, and it very much mobilizes activists in Argentina. But it is also politically risky because there's a lot of people who are against it within his own government as well.
Right.
So I think it's very admirable that he's followed through on this. I think also he had to. The pandemic, it was something he had promised in the beginning of March before the pandemic, and not following through on it.
Yeah.
Throughout the course of the year would have felt sort of like a broken promise.
Yeah. I mean, in just hearing the contours of the debate in Argentina, it sounds to me a lot like what's happening in the United States, probably what's happening in every other country, where you have three parties, right? You have You have the moneyed interest in the capital, right? In the major city, Buenos Aires. You have the people, the working class people, and the activists of the major cities, and then you have rural people with more traditional values, Catholic, evangelical. Is that fair to say?
There's a lot of that. I think one of the interesting things about the Argentina debate, particularly this time around in 2020 as opposed to 2018, is that it has been framed by abortion activists as a health issue and an equality issue, which doesn't mean that there aren't some people debating, at what minute life starts.
Yeah.
But it has been largely focused on the fact that abortions happen no matter what. Yeah. The question is who dies and how many people die in that happening. And the numbers are stark. It's very much poor women die trying to access abortions and rich women get abortions. And I think that framing does make it different from a lot of the debate that happens in the US and in other countries. And I think it's an important framing for Latin America. And I would hope that this does help push the region towards broader access to abortion and reproductive rights.
And I saw there was another push in the Congress that, to give financial support to young mothers for up to 3 years, which would be a really progressive agenda.
I actually think that's one of the nicer aspects of this, and it's been somewhat underreported, which is in response to all the people who say, well, let's not let people abort, let's support mothers so that they can have the baby, right, regardless of economic factors. And I think that ignores a lot of women's choices over whether to become mothers or not. But I think it's interesting that they presented this bill sort of in response to that, which is, okay, let's support women throughout their entire pregnancy and the first 3 years of the child's life, so that people can't argue that women are aborting for economic reasons. I think it likely wouldn't impact the number of abortions that are ultimately carried out, but it does say, nobody has been forced to abort for economic factors.
It's a nice jujitsu, way of countering the argument against, legalizing abortion, while also being humane, while not just playing politics, right?
Yeah, and I think that's great. The bill gathers together a lot of measures that are already in place, but it reframes them and strengthens them. And I think that also would be a valuable move that could be emblematic in the region if abortion comes through. And Argentina has really been a very strong feminist example in the region. You see the green handkerchief replicated everywhere, Ni Una Menos, over the years. So I'm very hopeful that this would pass, and in general for Argentina and for the region.
For sure. Let's move to Venezuela. I mean, that's been a major topic at the daily briefing for years now, right? I mean, what's going on with Venezuela? I mean, the way I see it, I'll just put out my position clearly. I was and am still for the Bolivarian revolution. Does that make me a Chavista? No, I'm not a Chavista. I'm not a Madurista. I'm not for. I'm for freedom. I'm a more of a libertarian socialist, let's say, right? But what's going on? I mean, there's stories that the December 5th elections were rigged. They were not open and fair. And the other sides are saying it was open and fair, that there were electoral observers there, and that everything was up to snuff. So what's going on?
Venezuela has always been a major topic for the Latin America Daily Briefing and for the region. This year, if anything, it was somewhat quiet because sort of the major clash between Maduro and Guaido, which had come to a head in over 2018 and 2019 especially, sort of fizzled. And there hasn't been much to report except that the crisis gets worse every day. The politics gets worse every day. The opposition is more fractured every day. And it's sort of like, sometimes I feel like, we're reporting the same thing over and over again, except the numbers just get worse and the quagmire keeps getting more intense. I think the elections this month were a turning point, not for good, but sort of, I think it closes the Guaido chapter, the one where we actually think that there could be any sort of a challenge of legitimacy from that sector, which I don't think people have considered a real challenge in legitimacy for a while. Yeah. But I think it sort of definitively closes that chapter.
Well, he had a chance like in that first month, right, in 2018, really, where he had all the momentum, the whole global momentum behind him. And then Maduro just held on like a bull, like, you know, like he's on a bronking horse or something. He just held on and waited him out. And now, as you're saying, like the whole Guaido thing is kind of settled now, because now, you know, his whole argument is that he was head of the assembly, and that's what made him, you know, legitimate president. Now that he doesn't have that, but he's still holding on. Guaido's still holding on. He's still calling himself the alternate president, isn't he?
He is for now. I think we'd have to see what happens in January when the new National Assembly swears in and the old mandate ends. Because regardless of whether these elections were free and fair, and I think most people, even people who are sympathetic to Chavismo over the years, or at least what inspired people to support it, will admit that these elections were not free and fair in the sense of free party participation, organization, regardless of whether people actually went to the ballot in a free way, which there's a lot of indications that they didn't. The whole setup wasn't fair. And I think most people recognize that at this point. But regardless of that, the mandate of the previous National Assembly and lawmakers has constitutionally ended. And so I think that puts everything into a new uncharted territory.
Right. Even Capriles is telling him to step down. So like you're saying, the opposition's completely fractured. Leopoldo Lopez is where? In Spain?
He's in Spain.
So it's, you know, I don't know, I've never been to Venezuela, but they seem to like their leaders there. You know, they want their leader there in Caracas. They don't want them, you know, some leadership leading from Spain, right?
No, and I think that's going to be a major issue, that a lot of people are in exile, but I think it's also understandable that they're in exile given what Leopoldo Lopez has been through over the past decade now. So I think there's recognition of that situation, but they lose touch probably with what's going on the streets and in the crisis on the street. I think this turning point will force opponents of the Maduro regime to find alternatives rather than the sort of the tug of war that has been carried out up till now. But I also think it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard to rally people. People are very tired. They haven't found solutions, and they're trying to solve their day-to-day problems, which include getting enough food and medicine. So it's not an easy situation.
Like I said, you know, I'm sympathetic to the revolution, just as I am sympathetic to the revolution in Cuba, and it's the same situation there, where like what the protesters, the activists say, like as an American, I'll say, like, you know, with my American principles or democratic principles, I'm for, right? Free press, you know, freedom of expression, art, especially art, right? Like leave art alone. And so, but then, you know, there's those arguments like, oh, you see where some of these activist groups are being funded by outside, you know, organizations, USAID or AID, which has a checkered a history of meddling in foreign elections, especially specifically in Latin America. So it's hard to. What I wanted to say is that this whole mess is not good for the government or the opposition.
No, it's not, and it can be hard from the outside. I understand what you say when you say you're sympathetic. It can be hard for leftists to sort of find the right line or determine how to react to Venezuela to Cuba before that.
That goes to like, you know, the 40s, right? Where, you know, you're either for Stalin or you're for, you know, Hitler, you know, but there's a middle way there somewhere and it's hard to find.
Yeah. I think personally what I've always found is that, of course, I'm sympathetic to people's struggles wherever they are and people's attempts to make a better life for themselves. And if that's a Bolivarian revolution or a Cuban revolution, then that's great. I think the easiest way is to draw the line at human rights violations, which is sort of like the easy bar to have. And it doesn't mean that means you can't talk to anybody in these governments or not. But I think that's sort of the easy banner to hold and to say, well, this is how far I can go. And of course, there's counter arguments over social rights and whose rights. But I think often it's fairly easy to identify when there are egregious human rights violations. And I think the Bachelet report on Venezuela has been very helpful.
What's it say? I didn't see that.
The UN Human Rights report on Venezuela documented massive violations by security forces in Venezuela, likely crimes against humanity. And it goes very much into detail over different crimes carried out mostly by the FAES, the Fuerzas Armadas Especiales. I'm losing the S. And I think those are helpful reports. Human Rights Watch has often been helpful in documenting sort of, well, these are things that we know cannot happen and that we should critique.
And then you have the cartel, the Sons too, right? I mean, how can you, again, I'm for the revolution. I'm not for the government, if that's a good distinction.
Yeah, and I think it's helpful. I mean, when it comes to Venezuela, it's important to note that people did indeed support Chavismo for a very long time and why they supported it.
Right.
I think, it's so easy to say they're dictators and to forget the level of popular support they have.
Yeah.
And I think that might be part of the reason why it's difficult to engage with these topics, because it's not as black or white, dictator, good guys as we like to think when we're analyzing from abroad. So, Maduro is bad and Guaido isn't that great. And so what do you do with that?
Yeah. And as we see, like over the years, the world has lost, much of the world has lost all sense of discerning or ability to discern nuance, right? To find nuance. And something like that's going on in Venezuela, you need nuance, right? It's not, neoliberalism versus communism, which side are you on? There's got to be, they're trying to refound a nation, right?
And
go ahead.
I think there's hope now that possibly the end of the Guaido option will permit for more nuanced negotiations moving forward. And I think hopefully the US change of government will also help that and will strengthen options like the European negotiations that were occurring.
Yeah.
But again, it's been very difficult. And so hopefully there will be some light at the end of the tunnel in Venezuela next year.
Let's move to a region that's near and dear to my heart because my mom was born in Honduras. She's Honduran. Central America. But before that, just as a passing glance, I noticed that the Latin America Daily Briefing doesn't, or at least to maybe I missed it, doesn't talk much or at all about Puerto Rico. What's the distinction there? Is Puerto Rico part of Latin America or not? Because we're a colony. I'm also Puerto Rican, so that's why I asked.
That's actually been an issue of debate because it's very clearly Latin American once you start reading the news, but it's also the U.S.
Yeah.
In terms of how it's affected. We had initially left it out just because it's the U.S. and the cutoff has to be somewhere. And I think because a lot of the politics are very U.S. oriented. Maybe they should be, maybe they shouldn't be, but covering it necessarily means covering a lot of U.S. politics directly. Right. However, I've been pressured a lot to change over the past year, and I'm thinking of maybe trying to include it a bit more.
I think
it is very Latin American.
Yeah, and as a Puerto Rican, I can say that Puerto Ricans would really appreciate if other Latin Americanists were looking at Puerto Rico as a Latin American country, because we're just a colony. We're not part of the United States. We're actually just owned by the United States.
I think that's a good argument for including it. I've also been working on including the Caribbean more, which wasn't initially on my radar enough, maybe because I'm Spanish speaking and it was sort of my prejuicio aimed more towards the Spanish-speaking countries in Brazil because it's just so big.
But you guys cover Haiti, right? And then again, if you guys cover Brazil, Brazil is Latin America. So the argument there I've often heard is that if Brazil is part of Latin America, then Haiti's part of Latin America. Then
definitely, and we definitely I've tried to include the Caribbean as much as possible. It's difficult also just because it's so fractured.
Yeah.
And it's harder to find news sources. Haiti is an exception. Cuba is an exception because those are places that are very covered. But I'm working on incorporating more sources and more.
That just speaks to the difficulty of putting together a daily briefing on Latin America, because you're talking about, you know, multiple countries with split personalities within themselves, right? I mean, and how do you? That's why you have to put it together as if, you know, you're talking to the person reading the daily briefing as if they already know the backstory, because
I can't cover the backstory. And I think it would get tedious if every single day you had to read. I mean, for a while when Venezuela was in everyday coverage, I got so tired of trying to dance around, you know, is Guaido president or not? Is Maduro president or not? Like every single day having to say, you know, this person who declared himself president, but half the world thinks he is, half the world thinks he isn't. It sort of became very rote. I try to include sort of the most basic stuff, just in case someone is new to a topic or hasn't been following what's going on in a specific country. And actually, since you mentioned the breadth, this week I launched a new Caribbean weekly briefing, which will be coming into force in January, but it's already online and working. So sort of trying to start a different spin-off briefing with a more Caribbean focus with different sort of sources and less frequent, because I do need to sleep sometimes.
Yet another newsletter that I'll be receiving and reading in my email. Central America. Like I said, my mom's Honduran, and well, what can you say about Central America? I mean, most recently they had, you know, ETA and IOTA, which landed. You know, again, this is indicative of what happens in Honduras. It makes landfall in Nicaragua, but Honduras, you know, got the worst of it. And the politics, obviously, you know, with Juan Orlando Hernandez and what's been going on in Nicaragua, and Giametti and Guatemala. What's going on in Central America? Give us your take.
Central America, each country has its very own specific going-ons, but then they also have this sort of overarching authoritarian slide that is going on, and the issue of climate change, which is affecting them in terms of extreme weather, like the hurricanes that we saw last month, and also the drought that is affecting the dry corridor. And all of these factors are pushing migration, which is sort of the real reason Central America makes international headlines, which is when migrants get out of there. So it's all sort of very convoluted.
Yeah. And there's also the coffee rust. I mean, there's just multiple things. And you saw that you guys reported that a caravan just left Honduras and got stopped at the Guatemalan border. And so it's safe to say that Central America will be something that America has to deal with, right? I mean, the way I've written it is that it's America's mess. I mean, America... This is over 100 years of meddling and trying to control what goes on in a region. And when you do that, you end up breaking a lot more things than you try to fix. That's a nice way of putting it.
And I think that's been evident, I mean, for the past 50 years in Central America, at least. And it doesn't seem to be getting better. There was sort of a bright spot of hope in Guatemala with the anti-corruption efforts. And that was really quashed over the past few years. And efforts in Honduras have been disappointing. Nicaragua's authoritarian government remains firmly in place, even though there are always reports that it's weakening or that something's happening. Ortega remains there.
And they're crazy. I mean, his wife is really nuts, isn't she? Like she's leading some kind of like religious, mystical revival or something.
She seems very esoteric, to put it lightly.
Weird. And then there's Bukele, right? In El Salvador. I remember when he first got elected, people were like, "Oh, he's on social media. He gives videos," and then he ended up being just as bad as the other presidents.
Yeah, I was among them. I was like, "This is great!" Like this young outsider in El Salvador, and his first thing he does is he changes the name of the barracks that honor sort of army killers. This is great. What else could El Salvador need? Like, this is the beginning of change. And it's been so disappointing to watch this rapid slide towards authoritarianism, which a lot of people in El Salvador civil society had warned about beforehand. There's a lot of independent media in El Salvador that was very much on top of that story.
Shout out to El Faro.
Exactly. And they were very much on top of that.
Yeah.
As it was happening in beforehand. And I was like, no, this seems interesting. Like, he's so fresh.
Yeah, I mean,
and
it's very painful being an optimist, right? I mean, they asked James Baldwin, you know, are you a pessimist? Are you an optimist? He's like, I'm alive. I'm forced to be an optimist. I'm alive, right? To say that I'm a pessimist means that life is an academic matter. But when you're an optimist, especially when you're following Latin American politics, oh man, you get your heart broken 3 times a week, right?
You do. And so that happened in Guatemala. You're like, now they have ousted corruption. Now everyone's going to court. No, not at all. Not happening. Sort of hardcore retaliation against anti-corruption crusaders, very strong reaction by the entrenched, corrupt political elite. And then in El Salvador, where you say, well, here's an outsider, he's young, he's a maverick. And even before COVID, there was this strong trend to sort of lashing out at journalists, the brief military takeover of the National Assembly. And then under COVID, very strong and worrisome repression and restrictions far beyond what you saw elsewhere and far beyond what seemed merited by the situation.
Like what? I mean, I remember reading about it, but, you know, my memory slips me. But recount some of that. What was he doing? I remember there was a severe curfew and...
There was the reaction was very strong and very swift, which some people have seen as beneficial because in other countries where we like the government, that was seen as sort of, wow, what a great move. When Argentina shut down, that was great. But when El Salvador did, it was very draconian and very fast and very long term. And what a lot of people were criticizing was that there wasn't adequate oversight over how these restrictions were being carried out, or how citizens could appeal. One of the very emblematic cases was a woman who was arrested, and I can't remember how long she was detained for accompanying her 5-year-old child to an outhouse in the middle of the night. So police determined that she had left her house when there was a curfew in place and actually detained her, leaving the child, separating her from her very young child, all because she had gone to the bathroom in the middle of the night. And that sort of became a very emblematic issue over how they were enacting these restrictions far beyond what seems sensible. And others were over how travelers were detained and quarantined without access to health care. There was one person who died during his detention for returning from a travel from abroad. And so a lot of these sort of cast light over how restrictions were being enacted more than the restrictions themselves.
Yeah, and people in Central America and mostly Latin America, they have an instinctual fear for any kind of mano dura tactic at all, right? Whether it's for good or bad, they just don't like it.
Yeah, and I think that was kind of my first reaction when COVID came on. It was like, well, we can't lock down. This is Latin America. We've done that before. We don't want to see any kind of a lockdown. I don't want to see police stopping anyone on the street for any given reason. We've seen that and it's never good. And in a lot of cases, actually, it turned out that it wasn't good, even in countries like in Argentina, where the government had a strong concern for human rights and didn't seek to implement mano dura policies per se, particularly in terms of enforcing the quarantine. It turned out to empower security forces that are less democratic than one might like, and it gave them space to carry out violations that they might not have been able to carry out otherwise. So even when the overarching intention was good and democratically oriented, these restrictions certainly give space for regressions in democratic norms.
And plus, you know, like we've been mentioning, corruption is endemic. You know, is the pandemic in Latin America before the pandemic came. A lot of these states, especially the smaller ones, but even the bigger ones, are narco estados, right? Narco states, where you can't tell who's a narco trafficker and who's a senator, right? So to give power to that system, to that government, is giving power to that narco estado, right? And Bukele seems to be thinking of renegotiating a truce between the cartels, or at least between MS-13 and Barrio 18, which seemed to curb violence when it happened before, but it also gave more power to the drug cartels.
I think a lot of the critique over a potential truce or not, and a lot of the aftermath of the 2012 truce, is how it's carried out and what level of transparency and openness there is about it. So I think a lot of people were angry about the old truce, but they're also very angry about the possibility of a truce being carried out undercover. I think, and I haven't been following that part as closely. So I don't want to speak too much about it, but I think a lot of the concern is what is granted and how it's carried out. And there's indications that really everybody has been dealing with the gangs in El Salvador, all of the political parties, including Bukele. And I think there's a lot of anger over what that means about the de facto recognition of power and justice. So I think some people defend truce-like approaches, but the question is also how they're carried out and how they're negotiated and what's conceded.
Right. I mean, because under the truce, right, they had basically the gangs were running their own prisons, basically, right? Running leaders are running things from inside cells.
Yeah, and I think that's a lot of what people were very angry. I think that's a lot of what angered people about the truce. I'm actually looking to see, but no, let's not.
And in Mexico, my wife was born in Mexico. Mexico is, as again, another case of when AMLO came in, I was like, oh wow, he's gonna shake things up. He's really looking to fight the system, and then all of a sudden he starts making all these concessions. And then he wants to, build a railroad through the rainforest. And then he wants to build another airport. Then he wants to do this and that. What is going to be the legacy of his tenure?
AMLO is, as you say, another major disappointment for those of us who insist on being optimistic about the region. Yeah. I also saw him originally as sort of a leftist maverick who might be sort of a return of the best of the pink tide. And instead, he's possibly a return of the worst of the pink tide. I think maybe from a regional standpoint, it's been so painful to watch him bow down to the US. And though he always promised not to engage internationally, actually watching him not engage internationally has been very painful.
You were serious. You were serious.
You really meant it when you said you wouldn't get involved. Like, great, okay, so that's your tactic. Yeah. Because Mexico could make such a difference, and
it's a powerhouse. It was really so. It's the second largest economy in Latin America, right?
And I think in the region, we all felt it was so necessary to have a counterbalance to Bolsonaro, particularly. And when he was elected, Macri was president in Argentina and Piñera in Chile. And it just felt like it would just be so great to have a leftist counterpoint to that, another voice in the Lima group, sort of different approaches. And AMLO said he wouldn't be that, and he has followed through by not being that. But he's also bowed down to the US far more than anyone expected he would. He particularly conceded in migrant rights, which I think was disappointing to everybody involved in human rights, particularly.
I mean, whatever Trump asked Mexico to do, he just said, okay, basically, right?
And that was an area in which AMLO had been very promising in the beginning, which was to bring a human rights approach to the migration issue and to asylum seekers. And I thought that was particularly disappointing.
He still says all the right things, but he just doesn't follow through with it. He does the opposite in a lot of cases.
Yeah, and the militarization issue has been huge in Mexico, and again, very disappointing and counter to what his campaign promises were.
Yeah, the Daily Briefing just reported. The Daily Briefing just reported that in the 40s, the military has more power in Mexico than any time since the 40s, which is.
Yeah, and they're involved in pretty much everything from building public infrastructure works to distributing medications. So that's very concerning, as is AMLO's intervention to bring former Defense Minister Salvador Cienfuegos back to Mexico, which I do sympathize with the sovereignty issue. But he doesn't seem to be very concerned with the corruption issue within the Mexican ranks. And there has been no announcement that would sort of make this better. Like, well, we're bringing him home, but we are going to delve into this and make sure that there's justice. There's been not a lot of discourse in that sense. So I think all of that has been very disappointing for people who were hoping for a Mexican government focused on human rights and a different approach to public safety, public security.
And now he wants to make it so that anybody who's working with, foreign security forces like the DEA or something has to put it out in writing and inform the government. But the corruption's in the government is what I'm not, here I am defending the DEA, but that's their argument and it makes sense. How are you going to report to a corrupt government what you're doing, how you're investigating things in their country?
Yeah. And again, I do very much sympathize with that because I wouldn't want the DEA taking a very strong role in my country. So I do sympathize with sort of the spirit of that, but the timing is very suspicious. And it seems it would further undermine other crises, tackling other crises in Mexico. So while I appreciate the spirit of that move, it doesn't seem like it's going to be very good for helping Mexican security.
And another thing that the briefing's been following is that, most of the guns that are being used in Mexico come from the United States. And most of the drugs that move through Mexico and why people are killing each other and why governments are corrupt in Mexico and throughout Latin America, it's because they're trying to get these products to American consumers. So isn't the solution, isn't it that nothing's going to happen in Mexico or in Central America or in Colombia or Peru, Bolivia, unless America changes its own drug laws and its own approach to its own drug problem and its own gun problem?
That's arguable. I mean, definitely those things need to be tackled, especially sort of the ease of obtaining arms in the U.S. and the U.S. drug problem. I think probably they both need to be tackled separately, but trying to quash the problem solely in Mexico, ignoring the U.S. aspect, doesn't make any sense. I think sort of this idea that, well, whose fault is it? I mean, I also like to play the blame game because, always the bad guy's fault. It's always sort of the colonial imperialist power's fault. But I think it also doesn't necessarily help figure out how Mexico should be tackling its problems right now. One thing is sort of the ease of obtaining arms and the fact that all of the arms in the country are mostly coming from the U.S. smuggled. I mean, that's something that the U.S. should, at the very least, try to help with.
Yeah. And, I mean, we're wrapping up in a little bit. I want to thank you for coming on. Let's move on to just briefly. I got to, give a shout out to Chile. Chile has been, really, especially the student movement there is really, taking hold of the politics, of the narrative there, of what's being talked about. And they're about to, what's going on with the old Pinochet constitution, which is crazy, right? Pinochet's, name in Chile is mud in most circles. In some circles, he's still revered, right? But they still work under a Pinochet, a dictatorship constitution. Does it look like they're finally going to get rid of that?
They are. They've voted overwhelmingly in favor of changing it, and they are going to change it. I think the question is, will that change be the change a lot of Chileans on the street are hoping for? And unfortunately, the pessimistic take is it's not likely to change matters that have people out on the street, at least not in the short term.
Right.
Possibly the question would be, well, will it help influence sort of the country's ideological north? And so will that help change the feeling that people don't have options to resort to? But also it's going to be a very long and drawn out political process. And the new constitution will overlap with a lot of other political process, a lot of other elections over the course of the next 2 years. And so there's also the concern that all this energy will sort of fizzle and either get channeled back onto the streets in anger as responses aren't being felt, or sort of fizzle and not enough change will happen in general. So, I mean, it's great that the constitution is going to change. And I think symbolically, it's so important for Chileans, for a generation of Chileans that has sort of chafed under the fact that there's still a Pinochet era constitution. And it's a chance for Chileans to revisit a lot of things. Indigenous rights are going to feature very heavily in the new document. And I think that's not questioned and that will be undeniably good. But it's not clear that the process will be the change that protesters hope it is.
I mean, it's sad that, you know, the way the state of things around the world, that a lot of people on the left, or just progressives, let's say, are just so desperate for symbolic victories, right? Just a symbolic victory. I know it's not going to change my life. It's not going to change my community or anything. Just give me a symbolic victory. And I remember reading about like 8 years ago how Chile was like, you know, so doing so well. The economy is doing so well. And then you read, thanks to the Daily Briefing, that, oh no, Chile is actually one of the most, it has one of the largest wealth and income disparities in Latin America, right? And so that system is still going to be in place on, that's, I don't mean to say something so controversial, but like, the Constitution is below whatever the economic relationships are in a given country, right? Whatever they're going to allow.
That's true. Maybe if we are wrapping up, I would like to end on an optimistic note.
Please.
Despite all,
I get dark real fast,
things.
Man.
Yeah, no, and it is dark, and the outlook for 2021 is awful. Latin America is going to be in the worst economic slump it's been in years. People are already desperate, so they're entering this stretch with very little in their backpacks. They have very little to use to get through the slump. Inequality is worse. Education is worse. There's people talking about a lost generation when it comes to schooling at this point. It's not clear how many high schoolers will even bother to come back to classes if schools ever reopen in the region.
Or the ninis. Another thing I learned from the Latin American Daily Briefing, the ninis, right? They're not studying and they're not working. They're just floating, right?
Yeah. And that, all of that is very grim, but maybe there's a point for the symbolic gestures that you've mentioned are important. And I think they do play a role. In Argentina, there was a very strong moment when Hector Kirchner in 2004.
What's going on?
Hang on. Just a brief interruption.
It's hard to keep kids quiet for too long, right?
It is hard. And we've been lucky to get this long, actually. Yeah. So there was this moment when Hector Kirchner in Argentina ordered the military to bring down the framed pictures of dictators. And you could say, you know, this was more than 20 years after the return of democracy in Argentina. There was little chance that the military was going to stage a takeover of any kind. But the symbolism of that really marked a change of an era and inspired a lot of activism. And I would argue that it played a hugely important role in enabling later policies when it came to human rights. So sometimes symbolic means a lot, and I think it's worth fighting for. And hopefully we'll see a lot more of that in the region next year.
Yeah, I'm forced to be optimistic, and I'm glad that, you know, there are people like you not only keeping your eye on this. I know it's tiring to put together. Like I said, it's tiring to read every day, right? So I can't imagine putting it together. And I mean, if it wasn't for the Daily Briefing, it's funny that you say 3,000. I'm thinking, like, I always wondered, like, how many people are reading this with me? Because I've been following it for years, right? And it's for anybody who doesn't know about it, please go. What's the website? LatinAmericanDailyBriefing.blogspot.com.
Yes.
I just get it through my email, which is the easiest way to get it. And again, there's so many things that what I do with it, I guess maybe you'd find this interesting as somebody who's reading it. What I do is I'll read the briefing and I'll just click on whatever I want to delve more into, right? And it's so great to use it that way, right? And but you feel bad, like, am I as a reader, am I neglecting what's going on in Paraguay too much? Why am I just sticking to Central America and the Caribbean or whatever? But yeah, so thank you so much for putting it together, and keep up the good fight, and stay optimistic. We need that. And thank you again for coming on. Let people know where they can find you and the briefing. I guess I gave out the website, but anything else you want them to know?
No, thank you so much for the feedback. I really love getting feedback from readers, especially when they clue me in onto aspects of national issues that I didn't know about, or new sources, or even just, whether they like to take or not. I get a lot of flack for some of my headlines, especially the ones that I do sort of last minute jotting out a headline. And it helps keep me on the straight and narrow. It stops me from being overly sarcastic when things don't merit it. Which is definitely my fatal flaw.
I tend to not agree with the position of the daily briefing. I don't really even know what it is, right? But I generally think that I'm way to the left of it. But that said, I do trust it. I still read it. So it's refreshing that, again, I'm not one of those people that I'm going to only read something if it's written by somebody who agrees with me, which is stupid, right?
I think the briefing doesn't even really reflect my political positions necessarily. I think I draw the line at, I don't think that objectivity requires that you give equal space to every side. I don't believe in that vision of objectivity, but I do try to keep it. I do keep it as honest as possible.
Yeah. No, it's basically the consensus of the international media, right?
And that's sort of the focus I try to have. I try to make sure I give space to activists or organizations that are defending human rights when those have a different point of view. And again, I think that's sort of the true north of the briefing. And it doesn't reflect my political position, but I try to keep it to something that would serve as a trusted source for the readers. And
I think that's why I don't take it personally against the daily briefing, because I know you guys are just talking about what the international media is saying. So like, it's almost like if you're to the left or you're to the right of whatever the international media is saying, you're just mad at the international media, right? With the narrative that they're spinning out.
And I try to keep it that way. Again, if something is very important to me, and I think it happens a lot, again, with human rights, with women's rights, with abortion rights, I do sort of use it as a platform to push issues that I think might not necessarily be getting as much coverage as it should in international media sometimes, or to look at very local issues that could be of importance, like when it comes to El Salvador or other parts of Central America. But I think that it doesn't reflect a particular political position, and that helps it keep it valuable for readers who come from a wide variety of perspectives.
Right. And if you're, if you're going to this new, anybody listening, watching, it's like you said, you gotta follow it for a while to really get your footing on what's going on. Because again, it's it's kind of insider. You either been following the story or you haven't. And now, I know you don't do many podcasts and stuff like that. Are you thinking of doing a podcast? Because that'd be a great idea.
I've been asked about it. It's not in the plans for the next year, but who knows? Maybe.
Because people, it's tough, right? Like, I just wanted to be a writer way back when. And then, the shift of way things happen, you gotta, like you asked me, why did I get into doing the podcast? I mean, people always tell me you're a good talker. You always yak our ear off about whatever. Why don't you say it into a microphone or talk to other people? I also wanted to meet people that I, couldn't meet in person. So it's really great with technology. But yeah, if you guys had a podcast, because, people, they either would read the newsletter or listen to the podcast, whether driving wherever. I mean, I know plenty of people would do that. So it's something you should think about.
Something to think about. And maybe I could turn to you for help with that, or at least advice on how to do a podcast. But thank you for reaching out and for being a reader. I can't believe how attentive you've been to sort of the years of the briefing. It's great to get that sort of a feedback. And I feel really honored to have this level of attention. So thank you for all the things that you've said.
Thank you for putting it together, and thank you for all the work you do. And I'll keep in touch, but happy
Please do.
holidays and Happy New Year, and stay safe.
Lo mismo, and have a good 2021. And thank you so much for having me on the show.
Cheers.